Get out of my house and don't bother coming back." My mother's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade, and I stood there in my coat, car keys already in my hand, while my father stared at the floor instead of at me. "You're 31 years old," she said, "still playing pretend with your little online shop, and you call that a life? Your sister has a law degree. What do you have? Boxes in a garage." I didn't say anything. There wasn't a version of the truth that would have landed that night. So I picked up the one bag I'd already packed that morning, because some part of me had known this was coming. And I walked out into the cold without a coat that actually fit the weather. 4 weeks later, my parents walked into a boardroom on Bay Street for what they thought was a routine investor meeting and saw my name on the door. My name is Margot Delacroix, and I was 31 when my own mother told me I was an embarrassment to the family. It hadn't happened in a single night. Things like that never do. It built up over years, brick by brick, the way resentment does when nobody says anything out loud until suddenly everybody does. My parents grew up in Halifax in households where a steady paycheck from a respectable employer was the entire definition of having made it. My father spent 32 years at the same insurance firm before he retired. My mother taught high school English for almost as long. To them, success had a shape, a degree on the wall, a title on a business card, a pension you could count on. Anything outside of that shape didn't register as real. My younger sister, Beatrix, fit the shape perfectly. She'd gone straight through undergrad into law school, articled at a firm downtown, and by 28, she was already making partner track noises that my mother repeated to anyone who'd stand still long enough to listen. At every family dinner, every Thanksgiving, every random Sunday phone call, Beatrix became the measuring stick. "Your sister just won a case worth $2 million, my mother would say, like she'd personally argued it herself. "Why can't you find something like that?" I'd stopped trying to explain a long time before that final night. Here's what they didn't know. Because they never once asked. I'd dropped out of my business program at 23, not because I'd failed out. Not because I couldn't keep up, but because I was already running something real out of a rented studio apartment in the East End of Toronto. It started small. Hand-stitched accessories. The kind of thing you sell at weekend markets, out of a folding table, freezing your fingers off in a Toronto winter, trying to make change for a 20. I taught myself how to build a website. I taught myself how to read a balance sheet from YouTube videos at 2 in the morning. Nobody invested in me. Nobody co-signed anything. I built it on a maxed-out line of credit and a stubbornness I probably inherited from the same mother who couldn't see it. By the time I was 26, the folding table had become a small workshop with 2 employees. By 28, it was a proper studio with a dozen people on payroll. And a wholesale account, with a department store chain that still makes me a little dizzy to think about. By 31, I had moved into office space in a converted warehouse near King Street. I had investors calling me, and I had a company that, on paper, was worth more than my father's entire pension would ever be. I never told them any of it. Partly pride, partly self-protection. Mostly because somewhere along the way, I'd learned that explaining myself to people who'd already decided who I was just gave them more material to use against me later. The dinner that ended things happened on a Friday in late October at my parents' house in Halifax, where I'd flown in for what I thought was just a regular visit. My Aunt Josephine was there, along with a cousin and his wife, and the conversation drifted, as it always did, toward Beatrix's latest win at the firm. Then my aunt turned to me, not unkindly, and asked, "And what is it you're up to these days, Margot?" Before I could answer, my mother let out a short laugh. "That's the question, isn't it?" she said. "We ask ourselves the same thing." A couple of people at the table chuckled, the way people do when they're not sure if something's a joke or not. I felt my face go hot, but I kept my voice level. "I'm running my company," I said. "It's doing well." My father set down his fork. "Some people build careers, Margot. Real ones. Your sister worked for everything she has." He wasn't looking at me when he said it, but everyone at the table knew exactly who it was for. Beatrix, to her credit, looked uncomfortable, shifting in her seat, but she didn't say anything either. I should have let it go right there. I'd let it go 100 times before. But something in me that night was simply tired, in a way I hadn't let myself feel yet, and the silence stretched a beat too long. And that silence apparently read as defiance, because my mother kept going. "You know what your problem has always been," she said. "The second something gets difficult, you quit. College got hard, so you quit. A real career felt like too much work, so you quit. Now you're what? Selling trinkets out of a warehouse, calling it a business, while we tell people at church, we're not sure what our daughter does for a living." She shook her head slowly, the way you'd shake your head at a stain you couldn't get out of a tablecloth. Such a waste. And then my father said the words I will never be able to unhear, no matter how many years pass. "You're an embarrassment to this family, Margot. You always have been." The table went completely silent. Even my aunt, who'd asked the innocent question that started all of it, looked stricken, glancing between my parents and me like she wanted to take it back. Somehow, I stared at my father, waiting for him to catch himself, to soften it, to do anything other than what he did next. Which was nothing. He just looked back at me, unflinching, like he'd been holding that sentence in a drawer for years and had finally decided to use it. "If you can't handle hearing the truth," my mother added, "maybe it's better if you don't stay under our roof tonight." I'd been staying in my childhood bedroom for the weekend, since my own condo renovations back in Toronto weren't finished yet. Something else they didn't know, because they'd never bothered to ask where I actually lived, or how. My mother's arms were crossed by the time she said it, like she'd already decided this was the outcome before I'd even responded. There was no apology in the room, no hesitation. No one walked it back. I sat there for a second longer, feeling the weight of every set of eyes at that table, and then I stood up, calm in a way that surprised even me, and went upstairs. I packed the one bag I'd brought for the weekend. I came back down, said a quiet goodnight to my aunt, because she at least deserved that much, and I left. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry until I was already on the highway, halfway to the airport, gripping the steering wheel like it owed me something. Over the next month, I threw myself into work, the way you throw yourself into anything, when you don't want to feel what you're actually feeling. We closed a new round of funding. We signed a distribution deal that had been in negotiation for the better part of a year. I moved out of the warehouse studio and into a proper office on the 17th floor of a building on Bay Street, the kind of address that makes investors take your calls a little faster. I didn't call my parents. They didn't call me either. Beatrix texted once, a short and slightly awkward, "You doing okay?" that I answered with an even shorter "I'm fine," because I genuinely didn't know what else to say to her yet. Then, in late November, something happened that I could never have planned if I'd tried. A private equity group my company had been courting for an investment round was hosting a networking event downtown, the kind with a guest list curated for strategic introductions. It turned out one of the firm's senior partners was a longtime client of my father's old insurance company. And somewhere in the chain of invitations, my parents' names ended up on the list, billed as guests with personal connections to the local business community. They had no idea what company was hosting it. They had no idea whose name was on the door of the office they were being walked into. They just saw an invitation to an exclusive event, with free wine and important-looking people, and in true form, they accepted immediately. 4 weeks to the day after they'd told me to leave, my parents walked into the lobby of a glass office tower just off Bay Street. A receptionist greeted them with the kind of polished warmth reserved for guests. "Someone important is expecting," checked their names off a tablet, and walked them up to the 17th floor. They followed her down a hallway lined with glass-walled offices, past a wall with the company's name etched into frosted glass, toward a corner office at the end with a closed door. She stopped in front of it. "Right this way," she said, and reached for the handle. My parents froze. They were staring at the name on the door before she'd even opened it. Margot Delacroix, founder and CEO. My mother went pale. My father actually took a half step backward, like the floor had tilted slightly under him. The receptionist, mistaking their stillness for confusion, glanced at her tablet again. "You're here for the investor reception, correct?" Ms. Delacroix asked that her parents be brought up early, before the rest of the guests arrive. "There's been some kind of mistake," my mother said quietly. But the receptionist just smiled and opened the door. I was standing by the window with a glass of water in my hand, going over notes for the evening, when the door opened and I looked up, and there they were. For a moment, nobody in that office moved. My mother's hand drifted up toward her mouth like she was about to say something, and then thought better of it. My father just stood there, completely still, looking at me the way you look at someone you're not entirely sure you recognize. "Hi, Mom, Dad," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Neither of them answered. The silence sat there, heavier than anything that had happened at that dinner table a month earlier, until the door opened again behind them, and two of my board members walked in, along with the head of the investment group, all smiling, all ready for the reception to begin. There wasn't time to say anything else. The room started to fill. I shook hands, made introductions, gave a short welcome speech about the company's growth over the past year, while my parents stood near the back, half hidden behind a cluster of guests, watching. Over the course of that evening, they heard it all secondhand, the way I never could have explained it to them myself. One of my board members mentioned, almost in passing, the valuation we'd closed our last round at. An investor brought up the distribution partnership we'd just signed with a major Canadian retailer. Someone else asked me, in front of a small crowd, what my 5-year plan looked like for expanding into the U.S. market. And I answered without missing a beat, because I'd thought about almost nothing else for the past year. This wasn't a hobby with good branding. This wasn't a folding table at a weekend market. This was a company with 40 employees, a 7-figure annual revenue, and investors in the room who'd flown in from 3 different provinces to be there. By the time the reception wound down and the last guests said their goodbyes, my parents were still standing near the window, untouched glasses of wine in their hands, looking like they'd aged a decade in 2 hours. When the office finally emptied, it was just the 3 of us. My mother spoke first. "Margot." Just my name, like she didn't know what came after it. I waited. She looked around the office, the glass walls, the framed press clipping from a business magazine someone had hung near the door without asking me, the city spread out below the window, and then back at me. "Why didn't you tell us any of this?" I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the answer had been sitting right there in front of them for years. "I tried," I said. "For a long time, I tried." "You never asked," I continued, when neither of them said anything. "Not once. Not what I was building. Not whether it was working. Not whether I was happy. You decided what my life looked like a long time ago, and nothing I said was ever going to change your minds. So essentially, I stopped saying anything at all." My father's shoulders dropped in a way I'd never seen before. The certainty he'd carried at that dinner table, the absolute conviction in his own version of the truth, wasn't there anymore. What replaced it looked a lot like shame. "We thought," he started. "I know what you thought," I said, and I wasn't angry when I said it, which surprised me more than anything else that night. The anger had mostly burned itself out somewhere over the past month, on long nights at the office, when I'd had nothing to do but work and think. What was left was just clarity. "You thought a law degree was the only way to matter. You thought if it didn't look like Beatrix's life, it wasn't a real life." My mother lowered her eyes. Neither of them argued, because there was nothing left to argue with. Beatrix arrived about 20 minutes later. Someone had apparently called her once the reception ended, and she walked in still in her work clothes, looking between our parents and me, and then around the office, taking in all of it slowly. She didn't look shocked the way they had. If anything, she looked like something had finally clicked into place for her. "I always figured there was more going on than what we were told," she said quietly. "I just didn't think it was this much more." That got the first real laugh out of me all night. Eventually, my father cleared his throat. I owe you an apology, he said, and the words sounded foreign coming out of him, like a language he hadn't practiced in years. I judged you without ever bothering to understand what you were actually doing. That's on me. So did I, my mother said, quieter. I appreciated it. I want to be honest about that. I did appreciate hearing it, after years of silence on the subject. But an apology doesn't erase a decade of assumptions. It just finally names them out loud. As they were getting ready to leave, my mother paused at the door, her coat half on. We're proud of you, Margot. A year earlier, even 6 months earlier, those words would have undone me completely. That night, they landed differently. Not because I didn't care anymore. Because I'd already stopped needing them to be the thing that told me I was worth something. After they left, I stayed in the office a while longer, looking out over the city. The lights of downtown Toronto strung out below the window like something out of a postcard. The company kept running. The work kept going. Life, somehow, kept going too. And sitting there that night, I understood something. I don't think I could have understood any earlier than I did. Success was never about proving my parents wrong. It was about building a life sturdy enough that their approval stopped being the foundation it stood on. The strangest part of the whole night wasn't watching my parents finally see who I'd become. It was realizing I'd already become her months before they ever walked through that door.